Anyone who's ever recorded any acoustic instruments will probably tell you it was more difficult than they thought it was going to be. There's many variables to take into account, whether it's the instrument itself, microphone positioning and placement, the room that you're recording in, the microphone. The list isn't endless, but I could go on for a while. Of all of those acoustic instruments I've worked with over the years, I would say the drum kit is probably the hardest one to get right. And of the drum kit, the snare is probably the hardest part of that to get right. It's always said back in the day, you know, if you turned down the sound of a mix, the thing you wanted to hear was the sound of the vocal and the sound of the snare. So it's that important within a mix. Most of us won't get the opportunity to spend weeks in a recording space where you can play around with tuning, possibly different snare drums, microphone position, placement, type, etc. But fortunately, the subject of today's video, the Liqud Death Snare plugin, apparently Liquid Death is water, takes away that need for you to a degree because they've done a lot of the work for you. As we'll see, you've got a great many options you can play with, and this means you can end up with quite a varied sound. So let's take a look. So here's what passes as the installation on Windows. So you will get a zip file that you download. So first thing you want to do is extract that. Obviously, there's loads of different ways you can do that, but don't just leave the files in there because sometimes that creates issues. So I'm just going to extract all of those. And in here, we get another folder. And in there, you've got one that says PC. Now, we're going to install the VST3 file. So they do say where to do this, but you just go into here and you'll see you've got Liqud Death Snare. You should see extensions if you've got that enabled, but if it looks like a cube, etc., if we make that a large icon, you can see that. So this is the thing we're after with the very clever 3 logo there. So you want to copy that. And then you need to go to your VST3 file. Now this by default will be C, program files, common files, VST3, and then you can just paste it into this folder. You can see I've got loads of other stuff in there. Paste it in there, and then you've installed the plugin. So that's that part of things sorted. Then we can see that's pasted in, and we're good to go on Windows. The only thing we need to do now is to copy the samples to a folder. That's covered in the Mac section, but I'm just going to look at it here as well. So back in Downloads, in here, we go to there. So this samples folder here, which has got all of these CH1 files, whatever they are, you need to copy that to somewhere. Don't just leave it in your downloads. Put it into your samples folder. Probably rename it as well. So I'm going to rename this as LDS samples. I'll put this onto my samples drive, and then you'll see later on how I point to it on the Mac. It's exactly the same on the PC, so the plugins interface is the same. So there you're good to go once you've got that done. So here we have the contents of the zip file. So in the case of the Mac, you actually get an installer. All it's doing is copying the plugin to the right place, but we can just run this. You go through the normal malarkey, click through, put in your password, and then you're in business. Just going to move it to the bin to clear things up visually. Now, the other thing you get is the samples folder. Now, the samples folder needs to be moved to a sensible position, whether or not you're on Windows or macOS. You need to do this step manually. I'm going to put it in my samples folder, which is in my music file, but obviously that will be down to you. But you do need to know where they are, because when you run the plugin, you'll need to point it at the samples folder. So that's the step you'll need to do. And once you've copied them wherever, you can open up the plugin in your DAW of choice. So we're going to take a look at it in Cubase. So as you can see, here's a new project in Cubase with Liqud Death Snare set up on an instrument track. And this is the one-time thing you need to do, which is choosing your sample folder. Straightforward, the same on Windows as well as macOS, other than obviously the actual location. So I'm just going to click Choose Sample Folder and then go to where I know the samples are. And we can see there, actually I called them samples, I just copied them across. So I'm going to just rename that to Liqud Death Snare samples. Hopefully that won't be misrepresented. There we go. As it says, is relocated. You might need to open a new instance of this plugin before it can be used. Now, the other thing you'll need to do is to put in your license key. Now, this is slightly unfriendly. You'll get a license key when you buy this, or you get your free version as it is at the time of recording. It's just a case of pasting that in. So once you put that in, you might repeatedly try and hit enter. That may not work for you. You need to click the little entry box there. You may find hitting enter works. I found on the PC I needed to click the little arrow pointing into a room there, and then you should be up and running and ready to actually use the plugin. So here we are in Cubase. I've set up the Liqud Death Snare as an instrument track, and we'll just take a quick look at the interface, which is pretty straightforward. So first things first, this plugin responds in 3 different ways. So on the right hand side you can see we've got rim shot, flam, and multi-velocity. So rim shot there, I'm not sure it actually is a rim shot, but there we go. Flam and multi-velocity. So this is one where it actually is velocity map. So as I hit harder, it goes from quiet to loud, etc. So those 3, you can pick different notes if you want, or you can do MIDI learn, fairly straightforward. So if you wanted to change that to C, I'd just tap MIDI learn, tap that, and you can see now it's responding on C, but I'm going to pop it back on D. We've got the ability to audition it, so if your keyboard isn't working or whatever, you can just tap it here. That works like that. Snare tuning. So this is one of the nice parts of the snare. So it actually tuned it separately. So this isn't digital retuning. These are actually different samples. So we've got every semitone over, I think it's 2 octaves worth. Yeah, so there's quite a lot of different choice there. We can hear it's going down each time. It's something that you definitely wouldn't want to try and retune via automation during the point of a song if the thing was actually playing, because you can hear sometimes it doesn't respond straight away, etc. So obviously that's something to watch. But it goes from low right up to high, which is a really interesting thing. You can definitely improve your song sound by making sure that the snare, it may not necessarily be the notes that you're thinking of, but so the snare fits with the song in question. Here we've got the one thing which I think is slightly oddly named. So this one shot, I think it should just be like single sample, because what it means is normally it's on kind of a random round robin thing. So if I play the same note over and over again, it's different samples each time. If I do one shot, it's the same every time. You might want that, you might not. If you're looking for something to be realistic sounding, you probably don't want that. But if you want it to be something pretty consistent and identical every time, then you will want it. But it's an odd name, because I don't think that really is a one shot. I think that's a slightly weird name for that, because normally one shot means when you press the button on your keyboard, the sample will play regardless of when you release the key. But there we go. Anyway, the important thing, the mixer here. So this should be pretty self-explanatory. So we've got all of these different mics. The way that these work generally is these are from being very close on the left-hand side to being very far away here. So we've got top and bottom, which are the normal things you'd have on most snare drum mic setups. So normally you'd have top and bottom, and then you'd have optionally a shell mic. So this is maybe a foot away, and you can hear that there. And then this one's a U47, which is a bit further away and gives it quite a bit of the sort of the power of the snare. Then we've got some overheads. Now these are in stereo. And then we've got close mics, which aren't that close. They're probably, they're close room mics, as it were. And then finally far room mics. So you can hear you've got real variation on these, and the sounds are made up mostly by varying the balance between these mics, etc. If you've not recorded snare drums or probably most multi-mic'd acoustic instruments, you probably won't know that the phase of the microphones can be a real issue. So we've got phase switches here, which allows you to invert the signal from any particular microphone. And if we take the example of let's say we're just going to solo the top and bottom mics and the U47, because I think this gives us a really clear indication. In fact, I'm going to put it on one slot so it's totally consistent. Now, if you listen to this, you'll hear that the tone of this changes. You may not get this instantly, depending on what you're listening to. You probably won't notice this if you're listening on a phone or whatever, but by changing the phase, what's happening is some frequencies are cancelling, other frequencies are being boosted. And there's necessarily no right or wrong to this. Sometimes it's night and day and you go, you know what, I definitely want it one way around. But you definitely will need to experiment with this if you ever do this for real. And playing around with these, you can hear. Now, let's see if we can see a difference, because you can definitely hear it, but often things like this don't necessarily make themselves apparent. So here we have it. We've got both of them on screen, and then let's see if we can see a difference in this here. So yeah, you can see there's some differences. It's not the greatest. It's not night and day, but it's certainly making a difference, and I can hear that. So the phase controls are really important in terms of the overall sound and the way they work with each other. Now, the distance from them will probably make greater difference, and that's probably why in this particular preset, these last three are phase reversed, because that will give you what Sam Pura in this case thought was the best sound. Now, obviously, you can mix these, etc., but these ones are stereo, so the overheads, the close and the far are stereo, so these are adding stereo depth, width to this sound, whereas these are just mono. And finally, we've got a useful master out and an overall phase control. So if you're finding maybe you're matching this with another snare, etc., and you want to invert the phase of the entire Liqud Death Snare, you can do that here. The user interface, you can change the size of it. So you can see we can go to 125%, which would probably be too big. No, it's just about right for my screen capture here. And also you can A/B between two different settings. So we can go, if we go to B, we can see we've got a completely different setup here, which is quite nice. And then we can flick between them. Which is pretty useful. And also we've got undo and redo, which is quite nice as well. So if you do something, you can undo it. All plugins should have that. The thing that I don't like on this is I don't like the way this menu works, purely because you have to click each part of the menu. So I have to click the first bit, then the second bit, and that seems quite... It's once you get here, it doesn't do that, but initially you do. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe they'll fix that. That doesn't seem to make much sense. But you've got all the usual thing. We've got quite a lot of presets to go through. I'm not going to go through them because you can do that. But you can see we've got all of these presets here, and you can audition them, obviously, and see how they work. So another nice touch on here is that we have multiple outs available. Now, there is actually a preset under factory presets here where it says multiple outputs. So this, if you activate this, you'll see that we've got multiple outputs turned on. Now, if you do this by default, even though you're playing it, you won't actually hear anything. And the reason is that these are all using different outputs. So actually it starts off on 3 and 4, which is turned off by default. And then you won't be able to hear it. So let's just go through what you need to do in Cubase to activate those. So you'd come out of the plugin here, and you've got a couple of different ways you can do it. You can either go to Studio and VST Instruments, or you can use the right zone if you want in VST Instrument mode, and then you can find the relevant plugin. And this is what you're interested in here. So activate outputs. So because it's turned on all these others here, I'm just going to tick all outputs. And because of that now, they're all on. And now we get all those individual parts. So if you don't want to do your mixing in the plugin, you can do it in Cubase. So now we've activated all those. You'll see when I play, these are all working. So we're going from the top to the snare, bottom, and then we've got a shell mic, the U47, near. Sorry, those are overheads, aren't they? And then we've got near and far. So now you can mix that. If you want to, you can mix all that in Cubase rather than using the plugin, and you've got more automation options, because one of the weaknesses of this plugin at the moment is that it doesn't seem to offer much in the way of automation. So if we just take a quick look at that, we'll do it on the single output one because it'll make life a bit easier. But if we look at what it offers up, it only offers up snare tuning and bypass. So all of the other controls, which you'd expect to be able to automate, so all of these other controls are not automatable at the moment via automation, which is a bit of a disappointment, particularly because it would be nice to play around with things like the phase and the mix as you go. But you can't do that. But because you can use multiple outputs, as we've seen here, you will still be able to automate those. And in case you weren't aware, each one of these does have a phase reverse. So it's that phase there. That will do the same as the phase reverse button in the plugin interface. So you will be able to do everything. And obviously you've got all the extra. You can add all the normal stuff you can do with mixing. So you can EQ, add effects, sends, this, that, and the other. So you've got more flexibility. It's just slightly more complicated as a setup. So I've just knocked up a couple of things very quickly to demonstrate the plugin being used as a snare augmenter, so adding it to an existing snare. So here I just loaded up some samples from the Steinberg Media Bay. So we just got some and you think that, that's okay. It's all right. But if we add in some extra snare, you'll hear the difference. So I'm just going to bring that in and out. Now, it's possibly a bit loud in the mix at the moment, but it definitely adds some bottom end that the existing snare in this particular loop there's some bottom end in there and there's some ambience as well. So that kind of thing works well. I think that's the style of music they're probably thinking of, certainly when you look at the script of the Liqud Death, it's like, yeah, this is the only music we ever listen to. We want no variation. Anyway, other than that, I think it has other applications. So let's just mute that and then move on to something else. So this, as the name implies, bit of trance. Again, knocked up just from the Steinberg sounds, which are available in Media Bay. And same application. So I'm just going to mute the snare at the moment. And same deal again. If I bring the snare in, play around with the tuning, we can find something that fits. So I think this is useful as a beefing up quality rather than just on its own. Obviously on its own, it's pretty useful. I think if you want to make something sound convincing, and it's the right snare sound, because obviously snares are fairly variable, but it's definitely something that you can add to increase the thickness, the texture, and give a bit of natural ambience to a snare sound, which otherwise is often lacking, because often when you get sampled snares, they're maybe a bit dry. Maybe people don't want to have so much personality in them, but this is definitely a snare with a certain personality, and if that fits with what you're doing, or it can be used just to add, say, a bit of depth underneath what you're doing without overrunning it, then I think it's pretty useful in that context. So there you go, a look at Purified Audio's Liqud Death Snare plugin. Now, first things first, I don't think this is going to be everyone's go-to snare plugin for one simple reason. While it offers plenty of variation in terms of the microphones and tuning, if you don't like the sound of the snare, that's it. It's time for something different. And this doesn't give you that. It only gives you that one snare drum. It would be interesting to see in the future if they or someone else could come up with a different set of samples which would allow you to use that interface to do the same kind of thing, but on a different set of sounds from a different snare drum. But that's by the by. Not sure whether that will happen. In addition to the basic use of it, I think there are two really good uses for this, and this is probably the first of which is where I think I'll be using it most, and that's to beef up existing snares. Quite often you find, whether it's one you've recorded yourself or if it's from a sample or from another instrument, snares often don't have that oomph and that power, that big immersive sound that you need. This is really good at bringing that, particularly because it's got all of those extra mics, and the further away they get, the more reverb they add, but they add some depth, which is not necessarily easy to find just by adding a bit of reverb to a snare drum sound. I know you can process snares even when they're pretty weak, but often I find that if you do that, it's very easy to end up with them sounding a bit ringy and processed. I know people say you can fix anything in the mix, and there's others say you should get it right at the beginning. I think you should get it right at the beginning, but often you don't have that option. If it's a sample, you get what you get, and you've got to deal with it. The other use for this, which maybe is a little more sort of highbrow, is I think it's easy to forget that if you've been fortunate enough, as I have, to have been able to work in a studio where you were free to experiment and you could do whatever in downtime, you learn a lot from doing that, and not everyone has access to that. There's plenty of people whose music creation will literally just be a laptop and a pair of headphones in their bedroom. They won't ever get the chance to go to a studio and do that kind of experimentation, and this plugin gives you a look into what that would be like. Obviously, it doesn't give you all the freedom of moving the mics and this, that, and the other, choosing them as well, but it does give you a chance to hear the difference that doing those kind of things do. So even if you only get the opportunity once to go into a studio, you might go, I really like the sound of a room mic or a really distant mic or a shell mic or whatever, and be able to apply that. As far as the plugin's concerned, I think it's good, but it's definitely not perfect. Aside from the limitation that it is just that one snare drum, the main problem for me is the lack of automation options. You've only got, by default, the tuning of the snare available as an automation target. Obviously, you can get around that by opening up the extra channels, sending that out and doing that in your DAW. But it's the kind of thing you think, really, we should be able to do that by default, because it's another step. And often I found that if there's an extra step to doing something, then unless you really want to do it, often you just go, I'm just not going to do that. So having that available by default would be quite nice, but it isn't there at the moment. I don't know what they're going to do in terms of changing this, because this, I think, is their first plugin. So we have no idea if this is just going to stay like that with little glitches like the menu that you have to click on for the presets at the first level, etc., that kind of thing. In practice, it's generally been pretty good. I've not had any problems with it other than the slightly clunky installation, which is why I featured it early on, because for a lot of people, that's a barrier to entry that means they just won't do it. I've been amazed over the years the number of people who've bought software and then just haven't been able to install it because it's alien to them. And I think plugin developers often forget that people want a one-click solution. But anyway, that's my overall slightly rambling summary of the Liqud Death Snare from Purified. I hope you found this useful, and if you have, please like, subscribe, do whatever else, I don't know, whatever else gets things on the front page of wherever. Start a TikTok channel, I don't know. Anyway, I'll see you again soon for more Music Tech Tuition.